Hi, everyone. This is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and today we have a very exciting episode because we're going to be talking about different types of triggers, the grief triggers associated to sibling estrangement. Now, sibling estrangement brings its own type of grief, and as with any type of grief, we can invariably be hit by waves that cause us to feel all sorts of chaotic emotions. And sometimes these can be unexpected in such a way as to upset and unsettle us. And in this episode, we'll be discussing some common experiences associated with the grief triggers of sibling estrangement and how best to navigate through them. So, Fern, it's wonderful to have you here.
Great to be with you as always. Triggers are very common and often unrecognized. So I think I want to start by talking a little bit about a trigger that I have and then discussing some of what happens with triggers. Um, One of the triggers I had came from my childhood where I was raised by somebody who was very invasive and did not respect personal space. And she used to wear these slippers, and these slippers would slap on her feet like this.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I was always on edge because as she approached, she had some expectations. Well, as an adult, I then developed a trigger where I was very uncomfortable with anybody who was making some sort of slapping noise on their feet.
Right.
My husband, who's a great team player, wanted to work with me on this. And when he and I first were married, he no longer would wear slippers because he knew how much they unsettled me. And he started to wear his bathrobe and tennis shoes.
Wow.
So, so eventually I did get desensitized to this trigger, but the problem was that whenever I heard that noise, I sensed somebody wanted something from me. So I want to talk a little bit generally about triggers. If you think of your brain as a computer, the triggers are the code that your brain is running on. That's the program. And triggers are the cues that your body adapted to in childhood and the conditions that you were raised in. So it's important to know what your triggers are and how you're going to respond to them because if you were raised with a lot of trauma or even a little trauma, you probably have triggers which were deep survival responses. And they worked really well when you were a child, but they serve almost no purpose now.
Exactly. Exactly. You said it wonderfully, right? That it's the code that we can sometimes have for us, right? Like a computer. And a lot of times we have to deconstruct that code, right? To be able to ultimately help us to see and feel and understand life better without those particular triggers. And I think that's so important because once we become adults, once we become conscientious of some of these triggers, then we can start to empower ourselves. And I think it's good for us to be able to talk about how these triggers can manifest, right? And I think that we can go through a bit of a list together today to be able to look at that. So let's look at the first one first. The number one trigger that we've identified is, first of all, sensory triggers, right? And that can be like a scent, a song, or an item, like an old birthday card, shared childhood toys, or a family photo, for example, that you may have that might unexpectedly remind you of your sibling and bring back bittersweet or painful memories, right? Especially when it's been that you may have had good memories in the past that you may no longer have. And I think that that type of physical reminder can especially contrast with the emotional absence that a lot of us experience because of estrangement.
Yeah, the one you didn't mention though, and it was part of my illustration, is audio triggers. And audio triggers are very prominent and can be really unsettling as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there can be all sorts of different triggers that can happen on a sensory based level, right? And there's visual, auditory, sensory, the taste, of course, the touch as well too. So there can be all sorts of different ones that we can start to experience that can be especially difficult for us. Smells too, especially in triggers, right?
Mhm.
And that's especially an important one as well too. So always important to consider where some of these triggers take us, right? Especially if we're taken for a ride by a particular trigger. That's really important to recognize what is happening to us. How do we feel about a particular trigger? The aversion that comes up, right?
Yeah, I've actually worked with clients where we identify large umbrella categories of triggers because they actually tend to fall into large categories such as invasiveness or dismissiveness. But it's worth taking the time to identify what they are so that you're not caught completely off guard when they occur.
Exactly, right? So naming it, of course, observing it, being able to tell when it's happening is especially important. Now, another one that's important to remember is what's called situational triggers, right? That's number two, right? Events like birthdays, weddings, holidays, or even a parent's illness that can cause the estrangement to magnify, especially. So you might feel their absence even more during moments that should be shared, right? Where there's supposed to be a communing of sorts that starts to happen. And it could actually, in turn, become an experience of anxiety about having to see them at family events, especially.
Right. I know some people who are so triggered that they cannot return to their family home, of origin, because it's too troubling. And so they avoid it because that's the quick way out.
Right? And avoidance is something that people eventually develop when it comes to some triggers, right? When you're triggered, you're putting your hand on the stove. You don't want to put your hand on the stove again, you know? So that's the avoidance, right?
Right. You don't want to evoke those painful memories and those emotional responses, such as anger and anxiety, and even physical sensations that come up from
Mhm.
visiting that home again.
Yeah. So being mindful of that, right? Being mindful of what can sometimes happen, where these triggers can take us when it comes to particular situations, family functions, perhaps past family references and such, like houses and such. Being conscious of that and recognizing that sometimes that can push your buttons, right? So, number three is emotional or psychological triggers. Now, inner thoughts and emotions such as guilt, anger, longing, and or unresolved hurt, such as sadness and shame, can be triggered when reflecting on the past or imagining alternate outcomes. Like, what if we had handled that fight differently, for example, right? And this is often what people that ruminate tend to do. They get into these internal responses that can end up becoming ongoing and complex and can be part of the grief loop, really.
Yeah, emotional triggers are really kind of tricky. But I think it's important when you have a big reaction to something that you ask yourself, okay, what is this really about? And now, oftentimes you have bookends, what I call bookends. So you have what's happening right now where you're having a big reaction, and then you have to think about what was the earliest moment where I had the same feelings. And typically there are bookends where you can see these connections. And once you become aware of that, you can cope a little bit better.
Yeah, they do that in EMDR, actually, going back to the point of origin, right? In that
Mhm.
sense, to be able to catch that and to be able to see how far back this goes, right? So it's really interesting that when you look at these float back moments and such, and to see like where did this originate? Where do you think it originated? And even just asking the question and exploring that without necessarily knowing the answer consciously will lead you down a path that can eventually, sooner or later, perhaps unlock some of where all of this started, right?
Oh, yeah. I think that's a great idea. And even writing, as I always say, writing it down and keeping some tab on it so that you are not blindsided the next time.
Yep, very, very important. And we're going to look into some strategies, of course, very soon when it comes to that. So, this is the psychological and emotional triggers to, of course, be mindful of. I think especially that come up within the context of sibling estrangement. Now, another one that people are familiar with, number four, is relational triggers. Right, seeing other siblings being close, hearing someone say, "My sister's my best friend," right? And or watching your siblings support each other through hardship, especially when there's more than one, that can stir a sense of grief, envy, or loss. Why am I not part of that? And it really highlights what's missing or broken in your own sibling dynamic.
I think it's dangerous to make those conclusions because we often don't see what's really going on. We don't know the whole picture. I'm not saying there aren't some siblings who are loving and supportive, but not all of them. And it isn't always as good as it looks. It reminds me of as you look at Facebook, that people are posturing and they're putting forth an image. And I'm not saying everyone is doing this, but I think you have to take it with a grain of salt and think about whether that's really what's operating.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that can be a big one too when you feel that you're triggered when you see or you hear about these close, warm relationships. Because again, yeah, it might be a reality for some people, but again, I think there's a whole lot of people out there that are like us that don't have that type of warmth, don't have that type of commonality or complicitness with their sibling. And I think that's really, really important to recognize that what we're seeing sometimes is only on one particular level. It doesn't mean like that it's like that for the full breadth of the relationship. So it's really, really important to recognize when that starts to happen as well. But that is also part of grief, right? Recognizing the isness of the lack of relationship. That's actually one of the first steps. So it's very normal for us to experience that as well.
So, internal spontaneous triggers.
Yeah, that's number five. So that's really important, and I think that a lot of times we can name different triggers, but there might be different types of triggers also that can occur that we don't always necessarily know. You might be suddenly feeling a pang of grief while doing something mundane, right? That you're not expecting, like scrolling through old texts or dreaming about a reconciliation or something that comes up that all of a sudden pops in your mind, and oh, okay, spontaneously, I wasn't expecting that, right? And even hearing their name unexpectedly can stir deep emotion as well, revealing the unresolved nature of the estrangement if we're not careful.
When I was estranged from my brother and I kept his name on my phone, every time I'd scroll past it, I'd go real fast because I was so uncomfortable seeing his name.
Yeah,
So that gives you some sense of it too.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that sometimes when I would see the green dot appear on social media, it would pop in my mind that why is she not talking to me? Why is she not saying hi or hello or anything? Why is it that if I do or when I did say hello, all of a sudden that green dot would disappear?
Mhm.
So it's a little unsettling when you consider that, but sometimes it can be that these triggers do happen unexpectedly, and we can be blindsided. And it's really, really important to be just mindful of the fact that this can happen and how to deal with this. And that's kind of what this is leading us into now, right? Into the what can we do, right?
Well,
For
before we jump into it, I just want to remind viewers that it's important to pay attention to your body and your emotional responses within your body because it will tell you when you're having a trigger, whether it's having brain fog or having shallow breathing or having stomach churning, something will happen within your body that's going to indicate that. And again, once you start to pay attention, you're going to know when you're triggered.
Exactly, exactly. Coming back to the body, going into mindfulness, what is going on here? What am I observing? Noticing what is happening. We start to become more familiar with the cues of what is happening within our bodies. And if there's a pattern that starts to form, then you can start to identify that. And that can be very helpful as well.
Mhm.
So, all right, so let's look into recommendations here for our viewers. What is it that we can do to help to, of course, navigate some of these triggers? Now, one of the first things I want to mention is something that's called the Hope Journal. Creating a Hope Journal can really be interesting to work with because the way in which it can work is that it can help to limit the negative impact of hope. Because a lot of times, what happens is that hope can sometimes lead us into re experiencing disappointment. And really, what we want to do when we're cataloging those moments of where we've had hope and having a second column where we talk about what actually happened, right? Then that can really be helpful for us to remind ourselves to protect ourselves by cataloging these past incidences. So, really, really important to look at how our hopes may have been dashed over time with the reality in the second column of what actually happened.
Yeah. I remember when I was really suffering with triggers, I would often feel like my past was living right next door to me. In other words, I could from here to the past like
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
And as I healed, I felt that the past became receded. It became blocks away, which is what it should be.
Yeah.
But that's what happens if you have serious triggers and PTSD.
Yeah, exactly. And you got to be careful about that and recognizing it and naming it, especially. And an example of something you can name, for example, in the what I want to column is that we would share deep emotional conversations.
Mm.
That's a hope that we can all have. I really wanted to have that depth and that conversation where we could feel connected with each other. And what
Mhm.
happened? She dismissed my needs and said I could handle things alone. Right. So,
And I think we're going to get into this in another episode, but it's how you respond to that is very important. Are you going to chase that person and try to demand that you get your needs met, or are you going to let it be?
hmm exactly. So that's a good precursor to what's coming up, of course, in some future episodes. So it's also important. So if people can start to do that, this is a great way of helping you to recognize patterns, recognize just how it is that you may have been triggered, or how hope may have created a sense of disappointment and such. So that way you can navigate through some of these grief triggers, especially when it comes to that. And another thing you can do also is what's called the chair dialogue. And the chair dialogue is about practicing with that part of you that is wounded. And usually, what I like to call that part that's wounded is the wounded inner child. And that's often the part that aspires to create connection, that aspires to something, that has a legitimate need, very much on an emotional level, to experience something positive. And what happens is that you can have a dialogue with this particular part where it starts to talk about its needs. I feel humiliated. I just wanted her to see me. And an example of that can be having the nurturing adult after that in the chair dialogue respond by saying, I know you were so brave to be vulnerable with her. She couldn't meet you there, but I will never leave you unseen again. And that's an important one, right? The idea of being seen, especially, and letting ourselves experience that when we don't have it in our sibling relationship.
Yeah, there's another way in which you can get at this, and that is to actually write a letter to that inner child where you talk about what you didn't get and what you can now get because you're an adult and you can give that comfort to your inner child.
Yeah, very much. So, and of course, people can go into therapy as well. Of course, I advocate for therapy, being that I'm a psychotherapist. I think it's always useful and serves as a way to grow and heal on our journey, especially. Right.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
Fern, we're almost out of time. Let's talk about resources. What would be your number one resource at this time?
Well, I think the Sibling Estrangement Journal has several ways to identify triggers and to address them and realize how they're disrupting your relationships. So I would encourage viewers to think about getting that journal.
Excellent. Yeah, great resource, especially. My number one resource at this time is the Sibling Estrangement Support Group on Zoom. I do this twice monthly, and it's a great way for people to connect with each other, feel that they can be heard by like minded people going through a similar situation, and especially to feel less alone. Because a lot of times we don't have a chance to talk about these different triggers that we can have, these different experiences that we can have, especially out there in the real world. So this gives us an opportunity to be able to do that within a safe environment, especially. So, Fern, this has been a wonderful episode. I'm so happy that we were able to talk about this subject matter. I think, especially with grief triggers, it's so prevalent in the sibling estrangement community and so important for us to talk about. So, thank you so much for doing this again.
My pleasure. Thanks.
We'll talk again soon. You take care.
You too.
Thanks.